Second guideline reads, the names of the prophets and the holy writers with the other names of the text to be retained as nigh as may be, accordingly as they are vulgarly used. And so the point of this guideline is to inform us that they did not intend necessarily for the names to be kept as close as possible to the Hebrew or the Greek, but as close as possible to what people were accustomed to. But as we have seen thus far, they did not always steer a consistent path on this guideline. Sometimes they give us a transliteration of the Greek, such as Isaac, and then put it back in the Old Testament as well as the New. Sometimes they give us a corruption of the Hebrew that's found in the Old, and they transliterate the Greek more or less, such as our first example on the board in front of you, Korah in Jude 11, Korah, or Kori, as he's called over there. You have multiple problems with Hoshea, the second name, Hoshea, Osea, Oshea, Hosea, Romans 9:25, Osi. You have all types of problems with that. Sometimes they give us a corruption of the Greek and then put the corruption of the Greek back in the Old Testament and then more or less transliterate the Greek over in the New, which multiplies problems, as we more or less have with our third example of Jeremiah. You have a corruption. The Jeremiah is a corruption of the Greek. It doesn't even relate to the Hebrew at all, and so it's stuck back in the Hebrew Old Testament, back in the Old Testament, and then rather giving us Jeremiah, the corruption of the Greek for the New Testament, they give us more or less a transliteration of the Greek. In Matthew 16:14 as Jeremias, with an S instead of an H ending. But then for some strange reason, in two other places in Matthew, 2:17 and 27:9, they give us Jeremy. Why they do that is just beyond us. One thing we're learning is that they're inconsistent on this. And I think we ended with number 4, and I want to pick up with 4 again. Isaiah, Yeshayahu is Hebrew name, and his Greek name, Isaias, because this will tie together in the 4th chapter of Luke with the next two Old Testament figures, Elijah and Elisha. Notice they have their biggest problems with the Hebrew names, the Old Testament figures. So number 4, Isaiah, number 5, Elijah, and number 6, Elisha. Elijah and Elisha are often confused just because they come together, and oftentimes people forget which one came first and which one is responsible for which acts in the Old Testament. Well, that's understandable. That's just a lapse of memory there. But a corruption of the names is inexcusable as far as a Bible translation is concerned. So Isaiah, you see all their names here, written in Hebrew, then written in English for you, then written in Greek, then written in English for you. Isaiah, Yeshayahu, similar to Jeremiah's name, Yirmeyahu. And Isaiah's Greek name would be pronounced Esaias. Esaias. E-S-A-I-A-S. 21 times in the first 6 books of the New Testament. It is found as Esaias. That's how it's spelled, Esaias. And so what we really have here is a corruption of the Greek in the form Isaiah. Esaias is simply a transliteration of the Greek. And all you've given us is a transliteration with Esaias. And I think we had ended with, what was that, Romans 10. Romans 10 in verse 16. Esaias is the Greek spelling and the Greek pronunciation. And so they give us the Greek spelling of Esaias, but then they change the pronunciation to Esaias. Romans chapter 10 and verse 16. But they have not all obeyed the gospel, for Isaiah saith, Lord, who hath believed our report? Now they've given us a long E instead of a long A pronunciation. It is a long E in the Greek, but a long E in Greek is pronounced like a long A for us. But you couldn't start his name, I don't suppose, with a capital A and with a line over the top of it. So here, one of those problems, and beginning Bible students, when they try to pick up a Bible and read this, of course, they're very confused with the names of these prophets. By now, you may already be accustomed to when to know this is Isaiah versus Elijah versus Elisha. But if you don't, then it'd be good to write in so that you don't put your foot in your mouth. Your modern translations, like the NIV, will keep all of this straight. If we're gonna corrupt his Greek name and call him Isaiah, let's call him Isaiah through and through then. In the Old Testament, in the New, in between, before, after, everywhere, let's call him Isaiah. Let's stay consistent. The modern translations will do that. Then number 5, Elijah. Eliyahu, his Hebrew name. Eliyahu. 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 His Greek name, somewhat similar to his Hebrew name, somewhat similar to Isaiah's Greek name, at least they both start with the same letter, Elias, Elias. It's found 30 times in the Gospels, plus Romans and James. That's where Elijah by name appears in the New Testament. 30 times in the Gospels, plus Romans and James. Old Testament name being Eliyahu, his New Testament name being Elias. Elias. But do you remember how he's spelled and pronounced in the New Testament, though? How is he spelled and pronounced? No. What? Elias. Elias. Elias instead of Elias. You have an E and then an I. Elias instead of 2 A sounds. Elias would be his Greek name, Elias. And instead they give it to us as Elias. For instance, in James, the one time he appears in James, the last chapter, 5, and verse 17. Starts off the verse, Elias instead of Elias. Elias was a man subject to like passions as we are. And he prayed earnestly that it might not rain, and it rained not on the earth by the space of 3 years and 6 months. Now, if we know the Old Testament account and narrative, we know that we're talking about Elijah here. Well, since that's what they gave us, and that's the popular form of his name, here's our chief problem with what they're doing with this second guideline here. Why don't they give us Elijah in the New? It seems like that they want to fulfill this guideline partially. This guideline says use the names of the prophets and the writers of Scripture and the other names of the text accordingly as they are vulgarly used. And he was referred to by English-speaking people as Elijah. And so they want to fulfill that, so they call him Elijah, but they only call him that in the Old Testament. For some reason, and it's inexplicable, so don't ask me why or how, I don't know why, it's inexplicable. When they come to the New, and they see that the way that his name is spelled in Greek, for some reason it clicks in them, we've got to be faithful to the Greek spelling. And so they spell it like this. But if you're thinking that, why don't you think we've got to be faithful to the Hebrew spelling in the Old? For the Old Testament, for some mysterious, inexplicable reason, it's okay to forget what the Hebrew said and spell it and call the man, pronounce the name as it is vulgarly used and pronounced. But then that's not carried over into the New. You get over into the New, and all of a sudden we have this second prophet popping up whose name is Elias, who of course can't be found in the Old Testament. Needless to say, they are the same individual, although many beginning Bible students don't realize that. Amen. I'm sure we all didn't at one time. We didn't know who those names were. Now it's probably a little elementary to you, but maybe that's not true of everyone here. And then number 6, his protege, Elisha. Elisha. Now that, Elisha, we just have a transliteration of the Hebrew now. We don't pronounce it the same, but this is a good Hebrew, just according to the Hebrew spelling. So, for once, we're grateful. For once, we've finally got a single out of this game. We're finally on base, because we have a Hebrew prophet, we have a Hebrew name, and we almost have Hebrew spelling and Hebrew pronunciation. Elisha. Instead, we call it Elisha. We change the pronunciation and change the accent and change a little bit of the vocalization. And then when you get over into the New Testament, this would be Luke chapter 4, if you'll be turning over there. You get over into the New Testament, all of a sudden we have Elios. And we have something similar as far as the transliteration is concerned in Luke chapter 4. But again, it's not going to be very faithful at all. Now, Luke 4 happened to be the passage that I just remembered, because whenever I really got into studying and reading the KJV, that I saw these names in the New Testament all the time. And of course, by method of either deduction or just studying the narrative account of the Old Testament, I found out which prophet was under consideration. And if I didn't have any help there, then I could always jump to a cross-reference and go back there and find out what prophet they were talking about. And so it stood out in my mind in all of my readings that in one and only one chapter of the New Testament do we have all three of these last three mentioned figures, Isaiah, Elijah, Elisha, all mentioned in one chapter, of course all with their corruption found here. And so Luke 4 always stood out to me as the only place in the New Testament where you could find all three of these names together. This would be Jesus' trip to Nazareth, verses 16 through 32. If you look in that section I'll give you the verses here in a minute. From 16 to 32, you'll find all three names there. It's interesting that he refers to Isaiah, to Elijah, and to Elisha. But of course, he refers to them here as Isaias, and Elias, and Eliseus. And of all things, we're talking about Isaiah, Elijah, and Elisha. And you will have them here as Isaias, Elias, Eliseus. Verse 17, there was delivered unto him the book of the prophet Isaias. Well, now that would be Isaiah there. All right, we're straight. Then verse 26, but unto none of them was Elias sent, save unto, I've got to read what I've marked out here. Is that an S-A? S-A-R-E-P? Sarepta, which is a corruption of the Hebrew name of Zarephath, a city of Zidon, unto a woman that was a widow. Well, now we had Isaias, now we have Elias. So which one of the three is this Elias? That's Elijah. Okay, now let's go to verse 27. And many lepers were in Israel in the time of Eliseus, the prophet. And none of them was cleansed, saving Naaman the Syrian, or the Aramean. Well, who is Eliseus? Who cleansed Naaman? This is Elisha, the protege of Elijah. So, Luke 4, I guess, would have to stand out. Verses 17 and then 26 and 27. In order, and you happen to have them in order that we've just given them to you as Isaiah, Elijah, and Elisha. So Luke 4 would be one of those peculiarities to remember as far as the KJV is concerned. You'll have all three of these names there. And then we have one more number I want to look at that I don't have above because it's really not that necessary. So we're on number 7. And the names are legion. I mean, there are other names, but these are especially concerning places, like this Sarepta instead of Zarephath. You'll find many place names that are very confusing. But we're not really talking about places. We're talking about the prophets, the holy writers of Scripture. And those are the significant ones. So without going into other names, let me end with a 7th point here, where we have the most unfortunate occurrence of Jesus for what should have been Joshua. And of course we have this confusion simply because the two names are so similar in their respective languages, Jesus being Greek and Joshua being Hebrew. As a matter of fact, they're essentially the same. The Joshua of the Old Testament, his name is the same. If you want to spell it in Greek, you're going to end up with Jesus. And if you want to spell Jesus in Hebrew, you're going to end up with something that's very similar to Joshua. And so, do you know where those two places are? Acts 7. Where's the other one? Pardon? Hebrews, not 11. You're in the right book, though. Chapter 4. Hebrews 4. See, some of you remember these little funny, odd things. Acts 7. If you're not getting blessed spiritually that day in your daily Bible reading, then look for peculiar things in the Bible. Acts 7 and verse 45. And Hebrews 4:8. We'll look at these in order. Now he's talking about the promised land, which also our fathers that came after brought in with Jesus into the possession of the Gentiles, whom God drave out before the face of our fathers into the days of David. That's very unfortunate. That's very confusing to someone who's trying to read the Bible. Acts 7:45. To find the name of God, Jesus, here, and we're talking about the dispossession of the Canaanites and all of the Otherites of the Promised Land, back in the book of Joshua, not in the book of Jesus. So you should have Jesus marked out and Joshua written in there. All of the names are the same. But again, for consistency's sake and for sake of clarity and for sake of not wanting to lose our mind as we read the Bible, then we've somehow got to stay faithful to these things and leave it as Joshua, even though the spelling might be the same in Greek as Jesus, and we're accustomed to seeing him always in the New Testament. But when Joshua's name appears and it has reference to the Old Testament figure, it's always Jesus. Then in Hebrews 4 and verse 8, and of course here they're going to be halfway honest by giving us what they really meant in the margin. Well, why didn't you do that for us earlier? Inconsistency abounds. You'll probably hear that word inconsistent time and time again as we wrap up our studies here in the KJV. And if that sounds like criticism, it is criticism. And a person who's inconsistent or translators who are inconsistent deserve to be criticized, because you're doing this for the good of the people afterwards, not to see how confusing you can make the matter. It almost seems that was the game they were playing. Let's see how we can confuse these people the most. Sometimes we'll put things in the margin, and sometimes it'll be a footnote, and other times we'll give the corruption of the Greek, and other times a corruption of the Hebrew, and sometimes a transliteration of the Aramaic. Let's see how confusing we can make this. I'm sure that wasn't what they were thinking, but it ends up being what they did. For if Jesus had given them rest, then would he not afterward have spoken of another day? I.e., that is Joshua in the margin. That's very unfortunate to have two times of Jesus. And I'm sure the NIV and the other translations will give you Joshua. So let's wrap up this second guideline here before moving on this morning. We were to ask ourselves, all right, they really made a mistake here, so what should have been done? One thing to criticize others, what should be done? Well, I think that their second guideline is very good. I just think that it should be followed consistently. In other words, since most of us are not accustomed to the true Hebrew and Greek spelling or pronunciation, most of us are not accustomed to that, but rather a corruption, perhaps on occasions a transliteration, but most of the time, a corruption, then let's stay with the corruption. We have enough to learn in the Scriptures without trying to remember. Yirmeyahu is the true name of Jeremiah. If we don't know him as Yirmeyahu, let's just remember him as Jeremiah. But if we're going to remember him as Jeremiah, let's remember him in the Old Testament as that, and the Apocrypha as that, and the New Testament as that, and the early church fathers as that, and text on Old Testament history and church history, and let's remember his name as that. This is what they wanted to do with their second guideline. What did they say? The names, retain them as nigh as may be accordingly as they are vulgarly used. That's exactly what I would argue for. I would not argue for Hebrew and Greek. Let's be very precise and literal and stay faithful. No, I wouldn't argue for that. That's too difficult to go back and relearn all of these names, these Hebrew and Greek names. I would argue for their second guideline. But I would argue for doing it and performing it consistently, though. Let's keep their names accordingly as they are vulgarly used. And remember Jeremiah as Jeremiah. And Joshua is Joshua, and Jesus is Jesus. Although there's no J in Greek, so his name couldn't be Jesus. But let's remember it as Jesus, since that's what we as English-speaking people know him by. And let's keep Elijah as Elijah, and Elisha as Elisha, and so forth. So second guideline, an important guideline that they did not follow. They drew it up themselves. And for some inexplicable reason, they chose not to follow it. Okay, third guideline this morning. We'll do 3 and 4. If we have time, we'll get started on number 5. 5 will be our next big important one. Number 3. Ready to write? Here goes. The old ecclesiastical words to be kept, viz. The word, quote, church, unquote, not to be translated, quote, congregation, unquote. The old ecclesiastical words to be kept. That really is that's the guideline. Then they give us an example. But it's found in the guideline, which may prove something for us here in a moment. The old ecclesiastical words to be kept. Then they give us an example. Viz simply means namely. Viz the word church in quotation marks. Viz the word church, not to be translated congregation. So your sentence would look something like that with the other words filled in. The old ecclesiastical words to be kept, comma, viz, namely, the word church, not to be translated congregation. So we're back to words, not really names so much, but we're back to words now. Earlier it was, let's keep the words as they're vulgarly used, the names as they are vulgarly used. Now let's keep the words as they are ecclesiastically used. The old ecclesiastical words to be kept. Namely the word church, not to be translated congregation. Now you have to remember that most of these men were Anglican churchmen. They came from a high church type of background. They lived in an ecclesiastical world. And so this guideline, I think, would be understandable for them. They wanted to steer somewhat of a middle course between the Latinisms of the Reims New Testament that we discussed before, these strange words that just is impossible to understand, like skenopagia. Let's steer clear. They wanted to steer clear of, they want to maintain the old ecclesiastical words, not these Latinisms of the Reims New Testament that we saw earlier, and not the more folksy renderings of the Geneva Bible, which would give things like congregation, which is kind of like a more homey, folksy, instead of that liturgical church word in there, they'd want to give something like congregation. Now, it would be my assumption and probably my argument that since they give us an example in the guideline of what they mean by the guideline, then perhaps this example is really what they're concerned about. They're somewhat in general concerned about just all old ecclesiastical words. But then why did they go on and name one in particular? They didn't do that with the second guideline. They didn't say, the names of the prophets and holy writers, viz. Jeremiah, and give us one particular example. They don't give us any example at all. Here with this third guideline, they give us a guideline, and they give us one particular example of this word church. In other words, they want church in the text, and not this term congregation. So since they gave us an actual example with the guideline, then it may well be that this was their major concern, was the appearance of this term church in the New Testament. So let's discuss this for a moment, the term church, C-H-U-R-C-H. In their day, church was a more churchy term than congregation. By churchy, I mean, ecclesiastical. Church was a more churchy term than congregation. It would carry with it the notion of the church, capital letters, T-H-E-C-H-U-R-C-H. And of course, if it carries with it that connotation of the church, well, naturally that would mean the Church of England, the Anglican Church. In other words, what they the psychology behind the use of that goes beyond the way the term appears in the New Testament. It's just a local, many times, not always, but many times just a local group of people to have all of the ecclesiastical, formal, liturgical trappings of churchiness along with it. So that when you see the term church, then you think of the great grandmother of the faith, almost personified church, and by that you would think of the Church of England. The Roman Catholics, when they use the term church, they think of Roman Catholicism. They're kind of equated. The church is Roman Catholicism. For the Anglicans, the church is the Church of England. And that homey, folksy term of congregation, which could almost mean any group of people gathered together in someone's living room, it just would not have enough of the liturgy behind it to be acceptable for them. You understand what I'm saying here? They're really after ecclesiastical words because they come from a liturgical background. Not the Puritans, but basically the Anglicans, and probably Bancroft, remember, is the one responsible for drawing up this list of 15 guidelines. Now, for us today, we could take a look at these two terms, church and congregation. Well, I think church obviously has a churchy overtone to it. You think of church, then you don't think of what the New Testament word and concept really is. You have various notions of either a particular denomination or a particular building somewhere. You think that this is the church, this building here, and they even call it, maybe even printed on the building will be called First Baptist Church. And so you would think that we named this building the First Baptist Church. This is the church. It has very liturgical, ecclesiastical overtones to it. And what about this term congregation? Well, it does too. I mean, what today, for us, it does as well. It's funny whenever you listen to lost people out there who don't know the lingo of Christianity, grasping for words, and they don't know whether to call it a homily or a lecture or a sermon or what, They don't really know what to call it. And they speak of the group out there, they don't know whether to call it, a congregation or an audience or whatever. But I think what has probably become acceptable today is that if it is in church, in a religious setting, then the people are called a congregation. But if you're outside of church, they're called an audience in. I mean, if you were giving a speech, if you're, Alexander Haig or something, and you're giving a speech out there, you're not giving a speech to a congregation. See, when I say that word, you think of church. You can see stained glass windows around you. He's giving a speech to an audience, but yet would hardly think of the pastor preaching to an audience out there. He is preaching to a congregation out there. So I would argue that both of these terms now have a very ecclesiastical, liturgical overtone to them. And that's why oftentimes we avoid using them. That's not 100% of the time true, and it doesn't have to be true. But on occasion we do choose some other term besides those. The New Testament has the term ecclesia. E-K-K-L-E-S-I-A, which appears 115 times in the New Testament, ecclesia. Now it just may be on my further studies and thoughts of this word, you always hear it explained as, that you make a division there, and ek means out of, and so and lesia means called, and so these are people that are, called out of the world. I don't know that etymologically that's really the way that we should understand this term right here. I don't know that we've got a preposition attached to a verb, and we now have one word, and if we break all that word up, then we end up with this group of called out people. In fact, the church is a called out people. There's no doubt about that. I don't know that that's the etymological base for this term here. But basically what the term does mean is an assembly of people. Or, of course, you could say a congregation. Or I guess you could say an audience. Because we're talking about a group, or you could call them a group. A group of people who have joined together, who have congregated together, who have assembled themselves together. Audience would be the least preferable of them, because audience is almost, such a passive word that you're sitting there looking at or listening to someone else. And so you have two different groups of people, one who's up front and dozens who are out in front of them, in front of him. Assembly, you almost have one group of people. They're all joined together. The KJV always translates this term, ecclesia, as church, except when it's used in a secular setting. Before I even give you that, that's over in Acts 19. Before we get into that, let me backtrack a little bit in the origin of the term church. Both the Scots and the German people, it's Scottish as well as German, have a word that looks like this: kirk or kirky. And perhaps you can see how we got church out of this. This was meant to be a K sound here. Kirk. K-U-R-K. Kirk. Well, it's the same as this sense. You know how CHs can be pronounced like a K. See, if you look at this, now, you see, as time has gone along, we have lost the K pronunciation of this, and we've attached a CH to both of it. But if you want to mark out this and mark out this, you have C-U-R-C. And just go up here, you've got K-U-R-K, because the C can be pronounced like a K, and then you've just got one letter difference, an I and a U, and they still sound the same. Kirk, same pronunciation. That's how we got our word church. It's not a biblical term, it's not even an English term, it's a Scottish and it's a German term. And there are some other languages on the continent that have a term very similar to this, that we get this from. And what that meant for them was a building. So it's no surprise today that when we say the word church, we think of a church building and not the people there. Well, that's become accepted terminology, and so you'll hear me use it on an occasion. And I think that over the years I've even used it more frequently than I did in earlier times, simply because now I think we all have an understanding. We went over this business years ago of kirk and kirky and church and ecclesia and assembly and called out ones way back in the old building in Waconia. So once we get an understanding of what we mean by all this, then I don't have a problem using the term church. And probably outside of this group of people, I'll use the term church. They won't know what you're talking about, assembly. I think assembly hall or kingdom hall, Jehovah's Witnesses. Oh, I've got it now. Now I know what you're talking about. You people are JWs. Well, no, not exactly. Not at all, because there's no end to that. So you're a congregation, we're a church. I'm a minister, a clergyman, a pastor, whatever they want to call me. All of those may not be New Testament terms at all. And we want to be sure that our understanding of these things are correct. And I know in earlier years I just always use this term assembly, because in using it I knew that I could get that in your mind, in your thinking. You know, if I use church and assembly and mix it up and use church more than assembly, then I'm defeating a purpose that I'm after of working church out of you and working assembly in you. Now we know that. Every one of you knew about assembly instead of church, and you probably have things stricken out in your Bible and assembly written in it. That's fine. That's really a better term than the term church. And I think I've got many places in mine stricken out and assembly written in, or assembly understood there. And that's exactly what ecclesia means, which appears 115 times. Not church, but assembly. And I say that the KJV, according to their third guideline here, let's retain the old ecclesiastical words. Namely, or particularly, or here's an example of, for instance, church versus congregation. It always translates a church, except in Acts 19, where the term is used in a secular setting. Now here's what, of course, is very interesting for us whenever we think about this and later study in theology the doctrine of the church, that this term ecclesia is not a religious term. It's not something that just is, coined by Jesus in Matthew 16 and used twice again by him in Matthew 18. By the way, the only 3 times in the 4 Gospels where the term ecclesia appears, once in 16 and twice in 18 of Matthew's Gospel, all 3 times on the lips of Jesus. Not something he just coined that can only and must only refer to his people, because in Acts 19 it is used of a secular pagan assembly and setting. Let's see, verse 32. We've got this great cry, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Paul is at Ephesus, outdoor stadium of 25,000 people. Some therefore cried one thing and some another, for the church was confused. Now, if they want to be faithful to the way they're going to translate it, they'd have to call it church, because it's ecclesia. But how could you call this mob of people out there a church? Well, you really couldn't because of the connotations that the term church has. So look what they give us, assembly. And that's really what the word means, is assembly. They should have stayed faithful to that all those other 100 times in the New Testament. But they are bound to liturgy and to ecclesiastical polity and policy. And so they stay with the term church. Verse 39, it appears I think 3 times here in this chapter. But if ye inquire anything concerning other matters, it shall be determined in a lawful assembly. Ecclesia, the term for church. And the last verse of this chapter. And when he had thus spoken, he dismissed the church of 25,000 people wanting to lynch the Apostle Paul. He dismissed the assembly of people that were together. Now, concerning this business of, as I said earlier, dividing it up with our preposition attached to a verb, the preposition as a prefix, we have our called out ones. Well, how would that fit this group of people here as being called out ones or something here? Well, it really doesn't fit that. It fits them as being an assembly of people, but called out ones, see, it doesn't really fit them. So if it doesn't really fit there, then that means that's not the basis, the origin of the term. And if it won't fit here, it won't fit for the church of Jesus Christ either. Although they certainly are called out ones. You'll have to base that on something else besides the origin of ecclesia. You'll have to find other terms. And the Bible does say that we've been called out of the world and that our citizenship is in heaven, so we are called out ones. But I don't really think that that fits the origin of this term. One other comment here on church before we go on. I said that it appears 115 times, and in all of those times except 3, it's translated as church. And here it's given to us as assembly. Those 3 being in a secular setting. And what's interesting is they even give us it translated as church whenever it refers to Israel in the Old Testament. Now, do you know where that, one case of that, do you know where that is? Do you know what the whole phrase is? Surely you remember that. The church in the wilderness. Yes. That's a famous phrase. The church in the wilderness. Where's that found? Brother Anderson, you just guessed what it is, and it's in the same chapter that you guessed earlier for Joshua. Acts 7. Both of those are found in Stephen's speech, Acts 7. See, I remember these little funny things. Acts 7 and verse 38. Stephen's preaching of this great man, Moses, the prophet, shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren like unto me, and him shall ye hear. This is he that was in the church in the wilderness. Well, that is hardly appropriate. If the church has this liturgical meaning of the body of Christ, and how could you refer to Israel wandering around in the wilderness as a church there? But they're so bound to that word. Here you should have called them the congregation. That's what's always found in the Old Testament, the congregation of Israel. You see, you find that term congregation in the Old. It doesn't refer to the church of Jesus Christ. So we'll let it refer to the Jews. We don't mind that homey, folksy rendering of congregation as long as you apply it to the Jewish people. And so oftentimes in the Old Testament you'll find a phrase something like the congregation of Israel. Well, why don't you give us that here? Except it seems like you're falling back to that too folksy, homey rendering of the earlier editions and giving us congregation in the New Testament instead of church. The church in the wilderness, which of course was the camp of Israel. Do we have time to get off on a little thing here? Yes, I guess we do. These men were Reformed scholars from a Reformed background, not from a dispensational background. And what those people want to do is to make a connection between Israel and the church. That the church today, that you'll often hear this phrase, is spiritual Israel. And that would mean, therefore, that anything that was ever promised to Israel, there's no way we can interpret that literally and physically, like a city and a land, and and Jesus going to come back on the Mount of Olives and all that, because Israel's done away with. And the church now is spiritual Israel, and therefore she stands in her place, and the fulfillment of all of those promises will be fulfilled spiritually in the church. So that may also be a reason why they wanted to stick church in here, because they're going to make a connection between the church of the Old Testament and the church of the New. Now you see, the theology of the New Testament does not allow that. Israel was Israel, something entirely, totally, 1,000% separate and distinct from the body of Christ, the church in the New Testament. So it'd be best to call us the church and keep congregation or rebel, some other term for the people of the Old Testament. Don't call both of us church. What you're doing, you're falling into Reformed theology. You're falling out of, they were never in, dispensational theology, which of course the latter of those would want to make a very clear distinction between Israel of the Old and the church of the New. So that all those promises made to Israel, although they might typically have spiritual fulfillment in the church's existence and in the individual Christian's life, in their true, literal, first historical sense, they refer to the nation of Israel. And so many of those, of course, have not been fulfilled. They will be fulfilled in the future. So I'll throw that in. We'll discuss that when one of these days we get into Reformed and dispensational theology. This verse here, the way it's translated in the KJV, is probably also to add a support to their view. This is a view of Calvin and Luther and all the Reformers, that God did away with the Jews and he put the church in Israel's place. Now the Jews are forever. God has no dealings. They're nothing in God's eyes. They're counted just like any other people. Lost pagans, and the only way into the heart of God is through the doorway of the Christian church. And you see, what they didn't understand is that temporarily that's true. A Jew today will not get to God except through the church. He won't get to God with his Jewish faith or something. But there's going to come a day when national Israel will be restored and saved. And she won't be saved by responding to an altar call by some Christian evangelist. She'll be saved according to Zechariah's prophecy when she sees the one whom she has pierced. Then she will mourn as one mourns for his or her only son, and she will repent. Yes.
Somewhere to talk about the Israel of God.
Yes, in Galatians chapter 6. That's their basis for this view of spiritual Israel, the Israel of God over there. It's only found once in the New Testament, and you look at it and you'll think that it's difficult to explain, but it's very easy to explain. Galatians 6, verse 16. But it's not. It's easy to explain. See, this brother's thinking, I think he's been like me. He's read his Bible and found all these dinosaurs, these odd things there. Sometimes maybe you could accuse us of reading it and missing the real meaning, the spiritual meaning. We were looking for semicolons and punctuation, Well, I'll speak for myself. He probably didn't want to be accused like that, but you can accuse me of that if you want to. Galatians 6:16. As many as walk according to this rule. We see the context here from verse 12 onward. He's talking about the Judaizers, those who want to come and have you circumcised. So there seems to be some play on the Jews versus the true church, the Christians. And then he seems to make a play then on the Judaizers, false Israel, and the true Israel of God, which is the New Testament church. And as many as walk according to this rule, peace be upon them and mercy. Whoever walks according to this rule, that neither circumcision nor uncircumcision avails anything but a new creation. Verse 15. Whoever walks according to this rule, peace be upon them and mercy, and upon the Israel of God. And upon the Israel of God. And for some strange reason, they have gotten out of that phrase, the Israel of God, is a synonym for the Christian church. It's a synonym for the church. And then the next step after that would be you would start calling the Christian church spiritual Israel. In other words, the Israel of the Old Testament is like the Israel of Moses or something. But the true Israel of God, would be the Christian church. So you have spiritual Israel and you have carnal Israel. And we're kind of just the fulfillment of old carnal Israel that God wiped his hands clean of.
Do they use Romans 10 off that?
Whenever they get over into Romans 9 through 11, they have lots of problems there. Because you're going to find tremendous weighty verses that speak just the opposite of what you would expect to find. such as in Romans chapter 11. Talks about the Gentiles coming in, and when the last Gentile comes in, so, Romans 11:25, all Israel shall be saved. Well, now that does, in other words, then what you're saying, if we're really Israel, and Israel is really us, then you're saying, so all the church will be saved. Well, the church is already saved, you couldn't be the church. So it seems like he's speaking of an ethnic group of people there. Not a religious group of people, an ethnic group of people. The Jewish, the Hebrew people, which of course Paul is. Well, we don't want to spend any more time here. That's getting off the subject. But you'd want to make a note in your mind of Galatians 6:16. It's the one verse that they all use, the Israel of God. So I think if you read it and think about it, it's self-explanatory there, though. It's saying just the opposite of what they think that it's saying. But that's a good point to bring up. Okay, still under this third guideline, let's mention a few other words. They gave us the one example of church, ecclesiastical words, but let's mention a few others. They choose not to give us the term penance, which was a very judicious choice. Very wisely so, they selected not to use the term or the phrase do penance. Where have we seen that earlier? The Reims New Testament. They gave us do penance. They gave us instead the older term repent, which is a better term. Both terms have to be explained. They're not obvious on the surface unless you're brought up understanding what they mean. You wouldn't know what the word penance or repent means. But it is a better term. Another term, they also would not allow the Geneva Bibles, little folksy washings, or washings. And so what did they give us instead? What's the liturgical term? Baptism. Oh, we could really get off on a debate here. What does that Greek word mean? Does it mean, what about the prepositions in or into? Does it mean that you have to go into and under the water? It's just amazing how much confusion has come from this. But this is a fairly good term here. Oftentimes this term baptism or baptize really won't fit the context there because of what, let me just put it this way without giving away what I think one way or the other, because of what we think about the term baptism. I mean, it talks about them baptizing their hands. Well, they didn't baptize their hands, they washed their hands. It was a washing. And some of the versions, let me think of, it must be Hebrews 6. Some of the versions, even today, will go back to washing or washings. If you're from the South, it's washing. You throw a R in there. But I'm not from the South, so it's washing. I learned that the word is not spelled or pronounced with an R. Although I've heard some of you Northerners pronounce it with an R, though. Washing. I think, washing. Hebrews 6 and verse 2, you'll find it of the doctrine of washings. You'll see that in some editions, the doctrine of washings. So I don't really want to get into the debate on washing versus baptism. Okay, another term. Charity was kind of an important old term. It did appear in the Bishop's Bible. It was a Latin term that was evidently started by Jerome, perhaps coined by Jerome in his Vulgate. Was picked up by Wycliffe, the first of the English translators to pick up the term charity. And it's used 28 times in the New Testament, the KJV, 28 times, without any apparent system. I think I gave you these statistics whenever we studied love and Christian ethics. It's used 28 times, with many of them being found in 1 Corinthians 13. There's just no apparent system. Why sometimes they give us charity and other times they give us love. It is the older liturgical term, charity. Now today, of course, charity doesn't have the meaning of love anymore. It has the meaning of like alms deeds or almsgivings or something. 1 Corinthians 13, you know how it's found here in verse 4. Charity suffereth long and is kind. Charity envieth not. Charity vaunteth not. Charity never faileth, verse 8. If I have not charity, verse 3. If I have not charity, verse 2. And now abideth faith, hope, verse 13. Charity. These three, the greatest of these is charity. There a large percentage of the 28 times it's found are located right in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And then let's end with one more example here under liturgical terms, and I think I pointed this out years ago when we studied Acts, but we'll come back and point it out again. And that is the use of the term ordained. Another liturgical term that was inserted that really has no business being there because of what the connotation that the word has when it's been used in a religious setting. The term ordained. It appears 4 times in the KJV New Testament. Now, of course, the term itself, there's nothing wrong with it. It has different meanings. You know, God has ordained us unto salvation from the foundation of the world, so there's nothing wrong with that. But when you say that someone God ordained, and it's a minister and it's in a church setting, then we see this whole formal liturgical process of the ordination of the minister. It appears in Mark 3:14, and I think, well, I could be mistaken here. I think most of these times, 3 out of 4, it appears in kind of like a ministerial setting. Mark 3:14, where if you don't know better, you end up with the thought in your mind of ministerial ordination. Mark 3:14, and he ordained 12 apostles. You know, they should be with him and he might send them forth to preach. And so you think of an ordination ceremony. Well, there's nothing wrong with the word ordained as long as we don't understand it in the sense of ministerial ordination, that he just ordained them. What the Greek really says here is that he appointed 12. And maybe the NIV will have something like that. I'm sure it doesn't have the term ordained. What does it have, appoint? Well, you follow along with these other 3 and we'll see what they have. I doubt the NIV will ever have ordained because of the connotations it has today. It has a formal liturgical connotation that is not there in the Greek, that was not here. Jesus didn't go through some service with these men. He just appointed them. He selected them. He chose them. Whatever term you want to put in there, but not ordained. So he appointed, or he selected, or he chose 12. Any of those words would be okay. Trying to see which one I want to go to next. I think it appears 5 times instead of 4. Let me look in 1 Timothy 2:7. Maybe it's in a religious context. I think it is ministerial in all of these. 1 Timothy 2:7. Whereunto I am, Paul speaking, I am ordained a preacher and an apostle, a teacher of the Gentiles in faith and verity. Now what does the NIV have there? All right, that's what I have written in my Bible, appointed. And because that'd be a good example. Paul said, I got ordained one day as a preacher. Well, he was appointed as a preacher, not ordained in some formal ceremony. Titus 2:5. For this cause left I thee in Crete, that thou shouldest set in order the things that are wanting, and ordain elders. I think in every case they're using this, and that's what makes me think they selected this term because it fits under this 3rd guideline. Keep the ecclesiastical liturgical terms because it would prove what they want to do. Of course, they go through their whole long ordination ceremony, so they would want this term to appear in a ministerial setting in the New Testament. Ordain elders in every city as I ordained thee. But now we have appointed. What does NIV have for that? 5. Titus. 1:5. Excuse me, 1:5. Titus 1:5. And then what does it have at the end of the verse? As I directed you. Well, that wouldn't fit then. It'd fit in the KJV to have 2 appoints, so. Appoint elders in every city. And then the places where I may have pointed this out to you would have been back in the book of Acts, chapters 1 and 14. Chapter 1 and verse 22. Acts 1:22. Here's why I gave you Titus 2:5. My notes have this. Like that. I must have copied from someone else too, and then I had to mark through it and get one. So it's kind of a 2-ish, 1-ish. Acts 1:22. Beginning from the baptism of John unto that same day that he was taken up from us, or looking for a successor to Judas, must one be ordained to be a witness with us of his resurrection. And I have written in there, must one become a witness. What does NIV have? Must become. See, I wrote that before the NIV was ever even published. Must become a witness with us of his. He just must become. He doesn't have to go through any ceremony to be ordained. He must just become a witness. So you'd want that whole phrase, ordained to be, and then add the letter C-O-M-E on the word be, and you've got it. Or you could strike out be, ordained to be, and write the whole word underneath or beside become. And then chapter 14 and verse 23, Paul's traveling around and they've gone to the cities and now they're going to ordain elders here. Acts 14:23. When they had ordained them elders in every, and we're to church here, in every church, and had prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord on whom they had believed. And I have, when they had chosen them elders in every assembly. What does NIV have? Appointed. So select, appoint, choose. That would fit for our Timothy, Titus, Mark, and Acts 14 passage, and then Acts 1 is simply just the verb be, become, must one become. So, if you get all that corrected, then you're correct there, but you want to make sure you can still see ordained, because that's part of the KJV. So it's the wrong translation, but we're studying the KJV. We may correct it, but we still want to know what it has to say. And then I want to end this morning with the fourth guideline, which I'll just read in a sentence, and it's very similar to number 3, so I won't have any comments on it. Fourth guideline. When a word hath divers significations, comma, that to be kept which hath been most commonly used by most of the ancient fathers. In other words, it's very similar to number 3. It again shows us the ecclesiastical nature of the project. When a word hath divers significations, some Greek or Hebrew term, if it can be translated variously. When a word hath divers significations, that to be kept, which hath been most commonly used by most of the ancient fathers. That to be kept, which hath been most commonly used by most of the ancient fathers. Now, do you see what they're doing here with points 2, 3, and 4? They are very steeped in history, very steeped in precedent, very steeped in history. How the names were vulgarly pronounced, that's what we want to stay with. The old ecclesiastical words, not a new word like congregation or audience or group or something, or assembly even. The old ecclesiastical words, that's what we want to stay with. If a Hebrew or Greek or Aramaic word could be translated variously, let's stay with the way it was generally done a long time ago by the ancient church fathers. They're very steeped in history, very steeped in church, liturgy, and tradition, and they simply don't want to change. And whenever they heard the NIV being done, they all turned over in their grave. And whenever they heard the Living Bible being done, they just knew that was a blasphemy that would send that man to hell. Because you're modernizing the ancient faith of the church. And they would have been greatly opposed to such a procedure. Well, we smile at them and pat them on their white furry heads for that. They were religious men, very steeped in church tradition. They just didn't want to change anything. And that's okay. That's understandable for those people of that day. But we would think otherwise. And if we were living in their day and we didn't have any more truth than they had, then we'd think the same way too, I'm sure. The Puritans didn't always follow this, you see. They gave us the Geneva Bible. They gave us some of those new terms, inventions, They They didn't always, because they weren't steeped in church tradition as much as the Anglican churchmen were. Okay, enough for this morning. Guideline 5 we'll do next go around, which will be a big one, very big one. We may not even be able to do it. We probably won't in one message. Guideline 5 will be a big one. Yes.
John 15:16, where you got the word ordained there, is that supposed to stay that way?
John 15:16. Okay, whenever I said, now I know why I said I wasn't for sure whether it was 3 or 4 or 5 times and how many of them were in a religious setting. Ordained appears other times. Those are the times it appears in a ministerial setting. Okay? That's what I meant. Thanks for asking that, because I need to qualify what I said. What I said was erroneous unless I qualify it. Ordained appears more times in the Bible, the KJV, than just 5 times. But 5 times in this ministerial setting, where it would need to be changed because of the connotations. Otherwise, the word is fine. He ordained us, because we know what ordained means. Chose, selected, appointed us. Be fine. We understand that. As long as the word is not used in a religious or church setting. Very good.
I think I had that changed in my old KJV.
Oh, really? Well, I might have mentioned, the term ordained back in Acts, and then everyone just goes to the Bible and changes all the ordained everywhere, which that's understandable too. Why people would overreact to something. It's always better to overreact than not react at all. At least you're growing then. If you don't react at all, you're a dead bump on the log. But he ordained us. He selected, appointed, chose, so forth.
That word's okay there.
Because you got it on terms like foreordained. You've got it on that too. We have to say foreselected or foreappointed or something. And that word has become a technical term now. Foreordained and foreordination, a theological technical term. For if we saw foreselected, we wouldn't even probably know what he's talking about there. So that's a good qualification, that it appears 5 times in a religious setting, and I don't know how many times above that. The only ones that need to be really changed are the religious ones.